So today I thought I would do a video on the basics of cash keys or tenant buyouts, whatever you call them. I get a lot of pretty much the same questions, frequent questions about what it is that they should know or consider in doing a buyout. So I'm going to go over some of the basics of it. In the beginning, doing your own research to presenting an offer to negotiations to making sure that your deal has basic deal points. So from the top, before you even present an offer to a tenant, you should get yourself educated on basically the local rules that are applicable to your tenant buyout, beginning with the buyout disclosure. So if you're in a jurisdiction that has a tenant buyout program, regulations about tenant buyouts, you're going to want to start there. So a lot of times you look at the tenant buyout disclosure, and that prizes the tenant of all of their rights, but also educates landlords on what rights tenants have. Many of the times it will refer to relocation. Some jurisdictions require a buyout at minimum to offer the relocation amount. So that means in the event that a tenant was being evicted for a no-fault just cause, like an owner occupancy, a substantial remodel, some sort of government order, an Ellis Act, etc., there's a relocation amount that the city has determined that tenant would get in the event of that. So for a buyout, while it's not a just cause eviction, it is a voluntary move-out agreement. Some jurisdictions say, look, if you're going to be presenting a buyout, you need to figure out the relocation amount that applies to that unit, and that should be what's offered to the tenant or what they get at minimum. Usually you offset that if there's any sort of rent debt, like the tenant owes rent, then you would offset that. But that is sort of the guide stick, the post that you start with. You usually go north of that. Very rare do you go south of it, especially when there is a tenant buyout disclosure. The tenants see that, and they typically want at least the relocation amount. If they were to call the housing board applicable to, your jurisdiction, the housing board would advise on the relocation amount. So you tend to offer that anyways as a base or offer more. Now, the next thing is, if you have never presented a buyout disclosure or a buyout offer to a tenant, you might want to talk to an attorney, set up a consultation, and go over the rights of the tenants, the rules and the regulations of it, so that before you present it, you're aware of what rights these tenants have. Some of them include the agreement has to be bilingual, so if they speak a different language, it has to be in both English and that language. The disclosure also has to be bilingual, so English and the language that's applicable to that tenant. The tenant a lot of the times has a right to rescind the buyout or cancel the buyout. So they have usually between 30 and 45 days to change their mind and cancel the agreement without penalty. There's also sometimes review periods between 10 and 45 days. The tenants have the right to review the agreement. And then there's filing requirements. So the final agreement has to be filed with the jurisdiction within a certain time period. So those are all things that you want to be aware of. There's also rules about multiple offers. So if you offer a tenant a buyout and they say no, or you don't get any feedback from them, you might have to wait, usually 6 months before you do another buyout offer. So those are things that you want to keep in mind when you're crafting your plan. The next thing is you want to also have some sort of backup plan. So let's say you're trying to do a buyout, but your goal is to own or occupy, but you're not sure you need to stay in the property for as long as the city requires you to own or occupy. You might want to try to do a buyout first, but be prepared that you might not get the deal that you want. The tenant might not agree to a buyout. So be prepared for your backup plan, whether it's going to be owner occupancy, if you're going to Ellis Act, if you do a substantial remodel, if you're allowed to. So any of those plans, if those are some part of your true intention for why you want the unit back, be prepared that you might have to follow through on that, because the tenant might not negotiate, or you might not be able to reach a deal with the tenant in an amount and a time frame that makes sense for you. Another thing is, let me check my notes because I did make some. Present an offer. So sometimes landlords go about talking to the tenant like, yo, what would it take for you to move? And I don't like that approach at all, because one, it puts the tenant on the defensive. Two, it makes the tenant feel like they don't, if they offer too much, if they offer too little. So what I like to do, or I recommend that landlords do, is you present the offer. What amount of money are you going to pay? when do you want the tenant to move out, and provide them the buyout disclosure if there's one applicable. So if you're going to be doing this yourself and negotiating it yourself, be upfront with the tenant. I'm offering you this. I want you out by this day. Here's a buyout disclosure so you know your rights. And then give them some time to review it, some time to think about it. When I do buyout offers, I put it in writing so the tenant has something in hand they can look at. And then I do follow-ups and, if there is a need for, negotiate with the tenants. But I give tenants the room to breathe, to look at it, to do the research, to call housing, to figure out what they want to do, talk to family and friends, because it's a big life-changing decision for tenants a lot of the time. So you want to give them the ability to get educated and informed, but not too much that it backtracks or takes away your ability to pursue like a legitimate eviction if you have one. So you don't want to give tenants too long of a time to review, but you also don't want to give too short of a time where they feel very rushed or basically bombarded by the offer, and they don't have enough time to really think about it and contemplate it. One of the key things to buyout negotiations is that it's a good faith negotiation back and forth. Doesn't mean that the tenant's going to get all the money and the timeline they want. It also doesn't mean the landlord's going to pay really little and get the unit back as soon as they want. But you have to sort of go back and forth. And there's general principles. There's sometimes there are amounts that are sort of basic or common for what's going on. Sometimes the landlord has good leverage. Sometimes the tenant has good leverage. But you want to have it back and forth, and you want the tenant to be participating in it. You don't want the tenant to feel like, they're being forced into an agreement that they don't agree with, they don't feel comfortable with, because one, it increases the chances that the tenants will cancel the agreement or not cancel it, but not actually move out. And then you're going to have to work towards enforcing the buyout agreement. So it's better that the tenants engage and enter an agreement that they feel they negotiated than one that they felt was very one-sided. The next thing is, we covered all that. Main deal points. So the main deal points in a buyout are, as you would imagine, how much money the tenant will get to move, when the tenant will be moving out. Then you want to talk about things such as what's going to happen with the stuff. Like if the tenant, typically you want the tenant to take out all of their stuff because you don't want to be responsible for it, or you want the tenant to dispose of their large bulky items because you don't want to be responsible for that. And in a lot of cities like LA City, there's a bulky item pickup program that's free. So the tenants can schedule that with the city, put their stuff on the curb, and it can be taken out. But you want in the agreement that the tenants will get rid of all of the stuff, take all of their personal stuff, and then anything that they leave behind, small things, are abandoned so you can get rid of them. And you don't have to worry about, the tenants trying to come back and claim them. Another thing you want to talk about is the security deposit. The three main things with the security deposit is the owner might keep it as part of the negotiation, the tenant might keep it as part of the negotiation, or the owner is going to itemize it by code. So in California, you have 21 days from move out to itemize the security deposit and give the security deposit back to the tenant. So you want to have that addressed in the agreement as well. So everyone's on the same page. Either the owner's going to keep it, the tenant's going to keep it, or you're going to treat the security deposit the usual way one treats security deposits when a tenant moves out. Another thing that comes up a lot is waived rent. I don't particularly like waived rent. I would prefer the tenant to pay the rent, and then if you want to incline to give them more money, then return the money when they move out. So a lot of the times a good way to approach it is, if you move out in 30 days, we'll give you back that 1 month's rent. If you move out in 60 days, maybe there's no extra bump. So you can do sort of a tiered option. If you move out faster, you get more money. If you move out later, you get less money. You can say, hey, if you move out by so-and-so time, we'll give you this extra bonus. We'll give you this money back. But waiving rent is one of the last case scenarios, and one that I don't typically like landlords engaging in, because you want the tenants to be paying rent because you as a landlord have ongoing expenses and things like that. But you don't want to find yourself potentially in a position where the tenants have not moved out and have not paid rent. And so you're in, the position of either evicting to enforce the agreement or evicting for the back paid rent, but you don't want to be out of pocket with the rent money. So waiving rent is not my favorite, but using that as, hey, I'll pay you back the rent money as a bonus or as an incentive, I'm fine with that. Another thing is when you're negotiating, you want to have the idea that you're going to be giving either a neutral or a good reference to the tenants going forward. So a lot of the times you sort of outline that in the agreement and say, hey, I'm going to give a good reference, I'm going to give a neutral reference. So neutral reference tends to be like if someone did a buyout with a tenant and maybe the landlord-tenant relationship like wasn't the greatest, so a buyout maybe happened. Neutral language is good because when you tell like a potential new landlord about the parameters of what happened with the current relationship, it's not something like, look, my tenant traumatized me and I pay them to get out. It's the tenant paid this, their tenancy started here, the tenancy is ending at this date. That's the information you provide. It's not very often that you have to do like a phone interview. Usually it's just, nowadays it's a lot of like templates or, questionnaires that new property managers or new owners will send out. But you want to have in there some sort of reference to that if that's something important to the tenant, or something sort of important to you. I've had a lot of tenant buyouts where there's sort of a strained relationship. And so, but the tenant, it's really important to them that they get a reference. And it also helps with, getting the tenant to move out, because that's sort of the ultimate goal here, right? Is the tenant buyout for the tenant to move. Another thing is advancing money. So a lot of these jurisdictions have cancellation periods where the tenant has up to a certain amount of time to cancel it. So within that time period, I try not to advance the tenant any money because it's very easy to give tenant money. It's very hard to get it back. So I'd rather wait for the cancellation period to expire to give the tenant money. And then usually it's an agreed upon amount, but typically you tie the advance payment to a milestone. So I usually put in there like, tenant will provide proof of a new lease, and you usually advance the security deposit in first month's rent. And then the remainder, the tenant gets when they move out. And of course, so long as the cancellation period is over, the tenant hasn't canceled. Now, you want to ideally have the largest amount of money be the final payment. So depending on how big your buyout amount is, first month's rent and security deposit could be a substantial amount of the buyout. So those are things where you have to use in your own discretion, or maybe your own, faith in the tenant that you think they're actually going to move out and hold up their end of the deal, that you don't have any fear or risk that the tenant will potentially back out or not move out. Then maybe you advance a little bit more and then, less money, but still more money is left at the end when they move out. Those are all things that you have to weigh given your specific situation. But a lot of the times tenants go, okay, I want to be bought out and I want all the money as soon as I sign. And that's very risky for a landlord. And it would be risky for anybody, right? Like to pay a bunch of money up front and the thing you're paying for not be done yet. So you usually don't give them the bulk of the money up front. You have to tie it to a milestone. Most of the money gets paid when they move out, because that's the thing, right? Cash for keys. Like when you turn in the keys is when you get the money. And tenants always come up, well, I need money to move. I need money for applications. I need money for moving expenses. All valid things. You just want to have proof. Maybe you give a stipend of a couple $100s so they can pay for applications, which is usually not a hurdle for tenants, but maybe in this case that might be for a tenant. Or, you tie, like I said, to a milestone or the lease. Show me a proof of a new lease and I'll advance the security deposit and the first month's rent. Or, maybe you've done that and they go, okay, now I need money to move. Okay, show me the receipt, show me the invoice, show me the estimate, the bid for your moving expenses, for buying all the boxes, for paying movers. And then you might want to advance that as well. So you want to tie, if you're advancing any money, you want to tie to milestones, because again, the goal is to make sure that you're helping the tenant move. You don't want to also be a roadblock for the tenant to move, because ultimately, the idea is that you want to help facilitate this as much as possible. So those are the main things that I always talk to clients about, the main things that we go over when I do consultations. A lot of times my consultation is geared towards the specific dynamics of what, the landlord tenant relationship was like, or the main reasons behind doing the buyout, so you can effectively maximize your approach, or end goal of like getting the unit back. But a lot of the times landlords don't end up getting information, or they don't do enough research up front about buyouts, and then they set themselves up for failure, because as much as the tenants know their rights, landlords should also know their rights and the responsibilities for these, because then it helps when you're doing the negotiations or you're having these conversations that you also know, because sometimes landlords will rely on information that a tenant gave that the tenant might not necessarily have correctly, or the tenant might have got information but maybe didn't clarify certain aspects of it when they got the information, either from an attorney or usually the housing board that they call. So you also, as a landlord, want to be apprised of what's all encompassing and involved with a buyout, so that when you talk to the tenant, you're not talking to them and relying solely on their information. You can also rebut and go, look, I did my own research and here's what I have found. And here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what I feel is fair. So you can have that sort of back and forth. But all this stuff is just general information for you. It's not very specific to anyone's situation. Buyouts vary drastically from zip code to jurisdiction to situation to tenant. I have some tenants that could be in the same complex that, buy out for relocation, and other tenants that buy out for more. I have tenants that don't have a lot of leverage but make it very difficult. I have tenants that have a lot of leverage and make it very easy. So it really all depends on the actual tenants themselves. Sometimes you have tenants that are older and you would think, hey, they would never be bought out, but this money could help them actually relocate so they'd be closer to maybe their family and their grandchildren. You had tenants that maybe are saving up money to buy a house, and this buyout money could actually help them facilitate that. This could be the windfall or the bridge that they need to, put a down payment on a home, which is my favorite outcome for a lot of tenants, is when they're able to actually buy their own house and this money helps them. But all these things are not really in a vacuum. They're very specific to a scenario. But the more that you understand and the more you're thoughtful in your approach, and even having empathy towards your tenant and putting yourself in their shoes, because this is a huge life-changing decision for a tenant. It's like getting offered a little mini lottery ticket that's potentially negotiable, but it's a business decision for a landlord. Even though it might feel personal, obviously, for a landlord, it comes down to the economics. It makes sense to do this, to pay the tenant to move, because you have some sort of benefit or value in that. So you have to also sort of frame that as well. Sometimes it's not the easiest, but a lot of these things are manageable, they are achievable, but they do take time. So thank you for attending my little video about this. I hope that you found it very helpful. I will link below my playlist on Cash for Keys videos. We'll also link my website. I have a weekly newsletter that I send out with the updates on local, state, and national real estate news. And I have a lot of articles that I write about buyouts and sort of the ins and outs of doing buyouts and Cash for Keys. So thank you, and I will see you in the next video.